The international hall was heavy with tension. Leaders, journalists, and dignitaries from across the globe had gathered for what was supposed to be a diplomatic forum. But when Donald Trump stepped to the microphone, the tone shifted. His words cut through the air like a blade, filled with arrogance and provocation. "Let me be clear," Trump boomed, his hand slicing through the air as cameras zoomed in. "Without us, Africa has no chance. No future. If anyone dares to defy America, we will crush them." That's not a warning, it's a promise. Gasps rippled through the audience. Some leaders shifted uncomfortably, others whispered among themselves. The weight of his words wasn't just a political threat, it was an open challenge. All eyes turned toward Ibrahim Traoré, seated calmly a few rows away. Unlike the others, he didn't flinch. His posture was firm, his gaze steady, as though Trump's declaration had been aimed directly at him, and perhaps it was. The camera panned, splitting the screen, Trump's fiery glare on one side, Traoré's unshaken calm on the other. The moderator hesitated, sensing the inevitable confrontation. "President Traoré," he said carefully, "would you like to respond?" Traoré rose slowly, adjusting his jacket with deliberate precision. The silence in the hall was absolute. Every eye, every lens, every heartbeat focused on him. And with a voice both calm and cutting, he began, "You threaten Africa as though it were yours to command. But let me remind you, Africa belongs to Africans. And no empire, no matter how loud its voice, can silence the will of its people." The room erupted. Some cheered, others froze, but no one could deny it, a storm had just been unleashed. The tension in the hall was palpable. Trump leaned back in his chair, his lips curling into a smirk as if Traoré's words were nothing more than background noise. He tapped the table with his fingers, then leaned toward the microphone again. "Strong speech," Trump sneered, "but speeches don't stop power. Africa has always depended on us, on aid, on trade, on security. Without America, your nations collapse. You can stand here and talk all you want, but talk doesn't win battles. We do." A murmur of unease spread through the audience. Some African leaders shifted uncomfortably, while others clenched their fists under the table. Traoré, however, didn't move. His face was calm, his eyes sharp, as if Trump's words were only fueling the fire within him. When he spoke, his tone was deliberate, each word carrying the weight of history. "Mr. Trump, what collapses are systems built on dependence. What fails are nations chained by promises that were never meant to free them. Africa is breaking those chains. And if you believe we can be crushed by threats, then you've misunderstood both us and history itself." The hall grew restless. Some clapped softly, others gasped, but everyone leaned forward. Trump scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "History? Don't talk to me about history. America is history, we've written it. And we'll write yours too, whether you like it or not." Traoré leaned slightly toward the microphone, his voice now lower, almost like thunder rolling in the distance. "Then be careful, Mr. Trump. Because the last time empires wrote Africa's story, they forgot one thing: Africa can write it back. And this time, the ink is ours." The audience exploded, applause, cheers, and even stunned silence colliding in one chaotic wave. Journalists scrambled to capture every word. The confrontation was no longer a debate, it had become a declaration. The moderator, sensing the electric tension, tried to shift the discussion back to safer ground, but it was too late, the hall belonged to the confrontation. Every word spoken was now history in the making. Trump straightened in his chair, his trademark confidence swelling. "You can dress it up however you want, but the truth is simple: without American money, without American power, Africa doesn't stand. You've built nothing on your own. Every step forward you take, we've paid for. And if you turn your back on us, you'll fall flat on your face." A ripple of discomfort swept across the audience. Even some European leaders avoided Trump's gaze, uncomfortable with the bluntness. Cameras panned across African delegates, some looked outraged, others ashamed. The weight of dependency Trump invoked was a truth many had lived with. But Traore stood tall, his voice carrying the strength of a continent ready to rise. You mistake silence for weakness, Mr. Trump. You mistake aid for ownership. Africa is not your project, and we are not your pawns. We are building our own future, brick by brick, field by field, voice by voice. And it is a future that cannot be bought or bullied. The audience roared with applause, but Traore raised a hand, calming the noise. His eyes locked on Trump's, unflinching. You see weakness where there is only patience. You see poverty where there is potential. But mark my words, what you dismiss today will stand taller than you tomorrow. Trump's face darkened, his jaw tightening as though the words had struck him harder than any blow. For a man used to controlling the stage, he suddenly found himself struggling to keep it. And in that silence, as the hall leaned toward Traore's every word, it became clear, this was no longer a clash of leaders, it was a clash of eras. Trump's fist slammed against the table, the sharp sound echoing through the grand hall. His voice rose, cutting through the air like a storm. You talk about tomorrow as if you've already won. Let me tell you something, Traore, without America's markets, without our technology, your so-called future is nothing but a dream. Dreams don't stand against reality. Power does. And we are power. The hall stiffened at the raw force in his words. Some delegates looked down, unwilling to be seen supporting such dominance. Others, particularly from Africa, clenched their jaws in silent rage. Traore didn't blink. He took a measured step forward, his presence filling the stage. His voice was calm yet powerful, every syllable a hammer striking truth. Mr. Trump, if your reality is built on exploiting others, then it is weaker than any dream. If your power requires us to kneel, then it is not power, it is desperation. Africa is no longer your shadow. We are our own dawn. The audience erupted, a thunder of applause and shouts shaking the walls of the hall. Cameras zoomed in on Traore's face, calm, unwavering, illuminated by conviction. Trump's face flushed red, his smirk fading into a glare. He raised a finger, ready to lash back, but for the first time his words stumbled before leaving his lips. The sight of a leader refusing to bend, refusing to cower, left him momentarily speechless. The moderator leaned forward nervously, sensing both danger and history unfolding. Gentlemen, he said softly, this is no longer a debate, it's a turning point. And the hall knew it. This was no simple exchange. It was the collision of old empires and new voices, of arrogance and defiance, of threats and unshaken resolve. The hall was no longer just a stage, it had become an arena. Cameras flashed like lightning, microphones caught every breath, and millions across the world watched live as history unfolded before their eyes. Trump leaned forward, pointing at Traore with sharp precision. You talk big for a man whose nation depends on scraps of our generosity. Don't mistake applause for strength. You think your words scare me? I've dealt with bigger leaders than you, and they all learned one thing, America always wins. The arrogance dripped from his voice, but beneath it was something else, an edge of desperation, as though Trump needed the world to believe it as much as he did. Traore didn't raise his voice. Instead, he let silence work for him, a silence so heavy that the hall leaned in closer. Finally, he spoke, steady and unbreakable, if America always wins, then why do you fear us speaking? Why do you tremble when Africa stands tall? Power that needs to remind itself it is power is already fading. The words cut deeper than any shout could. The room stirred, African delegates pounding the table in approval, others standing in solidarity. Even some Western leaders, caught between discomfort and admiration, could not hide the impact. Trump's face tightened, his bravado cracking for a fraction of a second. The cameras caught it, the brief flicker of unease. Traore stepped closer to the podium, his eyes fixed on Trump. You threaten us with the weight of your empire. But remember, every empire that looked at Africa as weak has fallen. And we are still here. We are not asking permission, Mr. Trump. We are declaring our place. The crowd erupted, an avalanche of sound, a tidal wave of applause that shook the hall to its core. The echoes of applause still thundered in the air when Trump leaned forward, gripping the edges of the podium as though the wood itself might steady him. His voice returned, forceful but edged with irritation. You think applause makes you strong? You think words make nations rise? Africa has no armies to rival ours, no fleets to match ours, no wealth to compete with ours. Don't confuse momentary pride with lasting power. At the end of the day, America decides who stands and who falls. The hall hushed again. The statement was raw, unpolished, a naked declaration of dominance. It left even his allies visibly unsettled. But Traore smiled, a small, deliberate curve of the lips that carried more defiance than 1,000 speeches. He let the silence stretch before answering, his voice steady, almost surgical in its precision. Power measured only in armies and fleets is a fragile kind of power. You mistake fear for respect, and dominance for leadership. Africa is not competing to be like you, we are choosing to be ourselves. That is something no army can destroy, no fleet can blockade, and no wealth can buy. The words hit like lightning. Delegates erupted, some standing, clapping, cheering openly. Others looked around nervously, realizing the tide of the hall had shifted. Trump shook his head, his face tight with disbelief. You're nothing without us. Nothing. Traore stepped closer to the microphone, his eyes locked with Trump's, unflinching. His reply was sharp, like a blade, then watch closely, because the nothing you fear is standing taller than you thought possible. The crowd roared, shaking the hall. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras zoomed in on every flicker of expression. This was no longer a clash of two men, it was a battle of symbols. The tension in the room had reached a boiling point. Every breath, every movement seemed amplified under the glare of the cameras. The moderator nervously shuffled papers, unsure if he should intervene, but the clash between Trump and Traore had already grown beyond control. It was the headline the world was waiting for. Trump jabbed a finger across the stage. His voice thundered, raw and unfiltered. You stand there pretending to be a leader, but without America, you wouldn't even have a microphone to speak into. Don't forget, your nations are built on the infrastructure we created, the systems we financed, the trade we allowed. Without us, your so-called independence is an illusion. The words were brutal, unapologetic. For a moment, the hall seemed to hold its breath. Traore's reply came slowly, but each word struck with precision. His eyes narrowed, his tone sharp yet composed. An illusion? No, Mr. Trump, the illusion is yours. You think because you built wires and roads that you built our spirit. You believe because you finance trade that you own our destiny. But the spirit of Africa was never yours to give, and our destiny was never yours to claim. What you call generosity, we call chains. And chains are made to be broken. The silence that followed was deafening, until it shattered into a thunderous wave of applause and cheers. The roar of approval rolled through the hall like a storm, rattling even the reporters' cameras. Trump clenched his jaw, visibly struggling to maintain his composure. For a man who thrived on dominance, being challenged so openly, so fearlessly, was an unfamiliar battlefield. And Traore, standing firm and unwavering, had just seized it. The hall was now trembling with anticipation. Every delegate, every journalist, every camera focused on the two men locked in this verbal duel. What had begun as a discussion had transformed into something larger, a clash between an empire's arrogance and a continent's defiance. Trump's voice cut through the storm of applause, sharper than ever. You talk about chains, Traore, but you forget, we forged those chains. And we can tighten them again. Don't mistake this crowd's cheers for protection. When America moves, the world follows. And when we decide, there's nowhere left to hide. His words struck heavy, laced with menace. The air seemed to thicken. Some in the hall shifted uneasily, their silence betraying the weight of America's reach. Traore, however, stood unshaken. His voice rose, not in anger but in conviction. If you believe you can silence us with threats, then you do not know Africa at all. We have endured slavery, colonization, exploitation, and every empire that promised us chains. And yet, we stand. We always stand. You cannot tighten what is already broken, Mr. Trump. The chains are gone. And with them, your hold. The eruption was instant, delegates rose to their feet, clapping, shouting, the thunder of unity filling every corner of the hall. For a moment, the sound itself was a shield, pushing back against the threats hurled moments before. Trump tried to raise his hand to quiet the room, but his gesture was swallowed by the storm of support for Traore. For the first time, the stage did not belong to him. Traore let the applause wash over him, then spoke one last time, his voice steady but carrying the force of a hammer. The world is not waiting for America anymore. The world is rising, whether you allow it or not. The hall fell into stunned silence, the weight of his words lingering like fire in the air. The tension had transformed into spectacle. The camera zoomed close, catching every detail, Trump's clenched jaw, Traore's steady composure, the restless movements of diplomats caught in the crossfire of words that were rewriting alliances. Trump leaned back, his voice dropping lower but cutting sharper. You speak of rising, Traore, but I see only talk. Talk does not feed armies. Talk does not build empires. And when the test of power comes, you will discover Africa's limits the hard way. It was not just a threat. It was a dismissal, a deliberate strike meant to reduce Traore to nothing more than a fleeting voice. But Traore did not flinch. His reply came like a blade drawn in silence. You mistake humility for limits, Mr. Trump. You mistake patience for weakness. But Africa is neither voiceless nor powerless. You look at us as a continent of need. I tell you now, we are a continent of strength, of youth, of unshaken resolve. And when the test comes, it will not be we who discover our limits, but you who discover yours. The crowd erupted once more, but this time it was not just applause, it was a wave of energy, of recognition that the tide of history was turning in real time. Even the reporters, trained to maintain distance, felt the weight of something greater than politics. Trump's lips curled into a forced smile, but the unease was visible in his eyes. He had entered the hall expecting to dominate, to belittle, to remind the world of America's grip. Instead, he was facing an adversary who refused to bow, and worse, one who had the crowd with him. The moderator leaned into his microphone, voice trembling. We are witnessing a debate that will be studied for generations. And he was right. The clash had gone beyond leaders, it was the spark of a new narrative for an entire continent. The hall was electric, every delegate on edge, every camera glued to the stage. This was no longer a political exchange, it was a battle of wills, of worlds colliding. Trump leaned forward, his voice carrying a final attempt at dominance. Mark my words, Traore. America doesn't lose. Africa will remember who holds the real power. His tone was sharp, meant to cut deep, meant to reassert control. But Traore stood taller, his gaze unwavering. He let the weight of Trump's words hang in the air before answering, his voice calm but unshakably firm. Africa will remember, yes, but not as you think. We will remember this day not as a threat, but as proof that we will never bow again. You speak of power, Mr. Trump, but true power is not in threats, it is in the will of a people who refuse to break. The hall erupted, not in scattered applause but in a tidal wave of thunderous clapping, shouts, and chants. Delegates from across the globe rose to their feet, many pounding their desks in solidarity. Cameras caught Trump's expression, a tight jaw, narrowed eyes, the realization that his words had been drowned not by louder threats, but by the conviction of a leader unafraid to face him. Traore raised his hand, calling for calm. His final words carried like a drumbeat through the hall. Let it be known today, Africa is not your shadow, not your pawn, not your silence. We are our own fire, and we will not be extinguished. The eruption of applause became deafening. For the first time in that hall, the spotlight no longer followed America's voice, it belonged to Africa's defiance. Today, the world has witnessed something bigger than a debate. This was not just an exchange of words, it was the breaking of chains that tried to bind Africa in silence. To those who believe power lies only in armies, money, or threats, know this: true power lives in the will of a people who refuse to kneel. Africa will no longer be spoken for. We will speak for ourselves. We will no longer be defined by others. We will define our own destiny. Let history record this moment, not as a clash of nations, but as the day a continent rose and said, "We will never bow again."